When learning a language, it's important to know many words, but it's also important that you learn the right words. How do you know which words to learn, and where should you find them? And how much can you express using only the 100 most used words? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about vocabulary, so learning words and characters. And that is because on June 10th, there is a vocabulary challenge starting. And if you're interested in that, you can head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com or simply check the link in the description. This time, the challenge is sponsored by Skritter, which means that there will be prizes available both for current users and those who haven't used Skritter before. I will also discuss the challenge along with learning Chinese characters and words with Jacob Gill, the CEO of Skritter, probably on Wednesday this week, and that will be on Instagram. If you want to tune into that, I'll put a link in the description. In this podcast episode, though, I want to talk about learning characters and words, and in particular, which characters and words to learn and where to find these. To illustrate the importance of learning the right words, I'm going to demonstrate how much you can actually express using only the 1000 most common words. And since this podcast is in English, I will do it in English, but the same argument could be applied to any language. So in the following discussion, I will only use the 1000 most common words in English, except for the word Chinese, because without that word, which obviously isn't in the top 1000, the episode becomes rather hard to understand and a little bit too awkward. But I'm only using 1000 words plus Chinese, and that's it. So let's get started. Which words you should learn and where to find them. When you learn another language, such as Chinese, it's clear that knowing many words is important. If you don't agree, I don't think you've had a real conversation in the language yet. When it comes to speaking and writing, you can sometimes get away with smaller number of words because you can control what you say, but when you listen to someone else speaking or when reading, you don't have that control. If the person is talking or writing to you, it might still be okay, but if the person is talking or writing with someone else, it becomes much harder. However, the number of words you know isn't very interesting in itself because it matters a lot which words you learn. If you learn the most used 100 words, you will be able to make yourself understood, but if you choose the 100 words by chance, you will hardly be able to say anything at all. Just to show you the power of knowing the right words, today I'm only going to use the 100 most used words. I have added the word Chinese since middle land language sounds a bit strange. So, which words should you learn? Now that we know that it's important to learn many words, but that it matters even more which words you choose, the next question is clear. Which words should you learn? Where do you find these words? The short answer is that you should learn the words you need the most. What this means is decided by a number of things, such as for how long you have studied Chinese. If you just started learning, it's probably a good idea to learn the most used words in the language or use books for learning Chinese written for students like you. The words you learn there will be mostly the same as those you need in normal conversations. It won't be perfect or good enough on its own, but it is a good place to start. If you studied longer, the words other people have gathered and suggest that you learn will become more and more different from the words you actually need. Even if you've just studied for a year or so, they can still be quite different. This means that there are many words in books for learning Chinese that you don't really need, and there will be many words you need that can't be found in those books. When you listen and read, learn anything you come across often, at least 3 times. Read on your computer or phone to make looking up any important words easy without having to learn them. When you speak and write, learn anything you find yourself needing to use often. For those of you who have studied Chinese for a long time, this becomes very important. The words you find in books written for students in this stage of learning are usually narrow and not something you really have to learn. They seem to be chosen without much thought for what language students actually need. It's also the case that while there is only one way of knowing nothing about Chinese, a few ways of knowing very little, there are many ways of knowing a lot. Your interests, the way you study, and who you are will lead to different situations. Books for learning Chinese also start using hard words too early, so even though it might feel like you're taking big steps forward, you might leave many important things behind. Because of this, the more you learn, the less you should learn words suggested by others, and instead move on to words you really need or want to learn. Still, there is a place for learning words suggested by others, even if you have studied for a while. You can use them to check if you have missed important words in your learning. By checking words suggested for students at a stage you have already finished, you can see if you have missed anything. These words should be used more often than many words you already know. In other words, this is a way of filling holes in your learning. If you feel that you need to know more words but don't know where to get them, or don't feel that you see or hear enough new words, the way forward isn't to just add a large number of words you find somewhere and start learning them. Instead, this is a sign that you aren't listening and reading enough. You're probably not using Chinese for speaking and writing enough either. If you did, you'd already have many words and expressions that you need to learn. Not having enough words to learn is a sure sign that something is wrong with the way you study. To help you and other students fix this problem, I often hold events where students can learn more Chinese by studying and learning together every day. There is one such event every time the moon goes around the Earth, and this time it's about learning more words. So let's end this little experiment, and I will no longer limit myself to the 1000 or the 1000 most common words. I can't use the word common because, common is not among the 1000 most common words in English, and I can't use 1000 either, but 1000 is fine and it gets the meaning across. So the point here is that I wrote this text a few years ago to illustrate how much you can actually express with only 1000 words. And even though some passages are a little bit awkward, I'm sure that most of you found that rather easy to understand, and I was able to convey what I wanted to say about choosing the right words when you're learning Chinese. For example, I cannot say textbook because that's certainly not among the 1000 most common words, and neither can I use the word list, which is rather tricky here because I am talking about word lists quite a lot. And even though I think these things make it a little bit harder to understand, I don't think that this is crucial, and it's kind of amazing how much you can say with just 1000 words. Obviously, this is not an argument to say that you only need 1000 words, because sometimes knowing the right word is the best way of conveying something, and if you don't know the right word, you need to be really good at talking around it, which is something we talked about in episode 73 when we discussed how to improve fluency by playing word games. But of course, I know more than 1000 words in English, and at the point where I did know exactly 1000 words, I wouldn't have been able to write this text. Rather, the point I want to make is that if you learn the most common words, you really can say quite a lot, whereas if I just picked these words haphazardly, I maybe wouldn't have been able to say much at all. So an important takeaway here is that having a very solid foundation with the most commonly used words is very important, and then of course you need to add content words and words specific to the themes and topics that you're interested in and that you want to be able to talk about in Chinese. And this goes back to what I said before. When you just start learning the language, it's very important to learn words that actually allow you to communicate about the things you care about. And that is quite likely to overlap with the most commonly used words in spoken Chinese, plus some words that are relevant for you as a student or in whatever situation you find yourself. When we're talking about frequency, i.e. how often a word is used, it's important to note the source or the methodology used to produce such a list. And I'll put a link in the description to an article where I discuss this in detail, but in short, many of the lists you'll find when you search online for, say, the most common Chinese words or most common Chinese characters are based on the written language, which might not be the same as you need when you're learning the spoken language. I'm not going to go into more detail regarding that now, but I have written an article called The Most Common Chinese Words, Characters and Components for Language Learners and Teachers, and of course I'll put a link in the description. So, zooming out a bit, the strategy, I think, ought to be that when you set out, you need to focus on the words that are most relevant and most important for what you want to communicate about. And when you start, this is probably things people will say to you, and some things maybe you want to say. And this will likely be the most common words used in the spoken language. Then, as your Chinese improves, you will need to focus on things that are important to you, even though they might not be very high frequency words in the language as a whole, and the words that people recommend to you in different word lists and so on will be less and less relevant. When you have studied Chinese for a while, you can still use these word lists, but I would say that the best usage is to plug gaps in your knowledge. So let's say you've reached an intermediate level, or you reached, say, HSK 4 or something like that. Then you can go back and look at HSK 1 to 3 and see, did I miss anything important here? You don't then advance to HSK 5 by taking all the words from that level and adding them to the flashcard program of your choice, and then starting to hack away at the list of thousands of words you need to learn. Instead, you read and listen a lot, and you add the words that occur often in the type of Chinese that you want to be able to understand and use. And occurring often here is the key, because don't add everything that you encounter that's new to you. I think most advanced learners have been through periods where they read or listen and simply add everything they come across. And this is rarely a good idea because it violates this frequency principle we talked about. Just because a word occurs once in a text that you're reading, it might actually not mean that it's something you have to learn. It's actually quite likely that if it only appears once, it's not that important. And remember, learning a word is actually the same as saying that you're not learning a different word. So this is not a case of the more the merrier. Yes, learning many words is good, but learning the right words is also important. Since it's hard to know which words are worth learning while you are learning the language, a good rule of thumb is to avoid things that you only see once. If you see something popping up over and over when you're reading and listening, it's probably something that's widely used in the language and you would benefit from learning it. But if it's something that only occurs in a specific context once, then maybe you're better off investing your time and energy elsewhere. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.